March 13th, 1942, 02:47 hours, the English Channel, 8 miles northeast of Dover. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hitchens pressed his face against the armoured windscreen of motor gunboat 64, straining to see through the spray and darkness. The twin-Packard engines beneath his feet hammered at full throttle, pushing the 71-foot hull through the black water at 38 knots. Around him, the channel was alive with the sound of high-speed engines, but in the darkness, identifying friend from enemy remained impossible until the first tracer rounds began to fly. Through the murk, Hitchens spotted a distinctive silhouette, low to the water, sleek, predatory, the unmistakable shape of a German Schnellboot, what the Royal Navy had nicknamed E-boats, enemy motorboats. These fast attack craft had terrorized British coastal convoys for 2 years, striking from the darkness with torpedoes and disappearing before defences could respond. They had sunk hundreds of thousands of tons of Allied shipping, killed thousands of sailors, and created a crisis in the narrow waters that Britain depended on for survival. But tonight was different. Tonight, MGB 64 wasn't running away, it was hunting, and when Hitchens gave the order to open fire, the night exploded with a violence the German crews had never experienced from British coastal forces. 6 power-operated machine guns, a 2-pounder cannon, and a 6-pounder gun unleashed a storm of fire that turned the water around the E-boat into a cauldron of explosions and tracer rounds. The Germans, accustomed to outgunning their opponents, discovered they had sailed into a revolution in small boat warfare. The story of how Britain turned the tables on Germany's most successful coastal raiders begins not with triumph, but with disaster. In the early years of World War II, the German Kriegsmarine had created a weapon perfectly suited to Germany's strategic situation. Unable to challenge the Royal Navy's capital ships directly, Germany invested in fast attack craft capable of striking British shipping in coastal waters where large warships couldn't effectively operate. The Schnellboot, designated S-boot by the Germans, represented decades of development by the Lürssen shipyard in Bremen. These vessels, typically ranging from 90 to 115 feet in length, combined speed, seaworthiness, and hitting power in ways that British coastal craft couldn't match. Powered by 3 Daimler-Benz diesel engines, producing a combined 4,000 horsepower, the S-boats could reach speeds of 43 knots in calm water. More importantly, their diesel engines produced far less vibration and noise than the gasoline engines used by British boats, allowing them to approach targets almost silently. The S-boats carried 2 21-inch torpedoes, the same weapon used by German U-boats and destroyers. These torpedoes, with warheads containing 617 pounds of hexanite explosive, could sink a destroyer or cripple a cruiser with a single hit. Against merchant ships, they were devastating. The boats also mounted defensive armament, typically 2 20mm cannon and multiple machine guns, sufficient to deal with the lightly armed British motor torpedo boats that initially opposed them. But the S-boats' most decisive advantage was their hull design. German engineers had perfected the round bilge hull, a design that handled rough seas far better than the hard chine hulls used by British boats. In the notoriously choppy waters of the English Channel, this meant S-boats could operate effectively in conditions that forced British boats to reduce speed or return to port. Time and again, German flotillas struck in weather that kept British defenders at their moorings. The impact of these advantages became apparent immediately after the fall of France in June 1940. German S-boat flotillas established bases at Cherbourg, Boulogne, Ostend and other Channel ports, putting them within easy striking distance of Britain's vital coastal convoy routes. The narrow waters between England and occupied Europe became a killing ground, where German boats struck repeatedly with near impunity. The statistics told a grim story. Between July 1940 and December 1941, German S-boats sank or damaged over 120 merchant vessels in British coastal waters, totaling more than 400,000 tons of shipping. They also sank 12 destroyers, numerous smaller warships, and killed over 2,000 Allied sailors and merchant seamen. The psychological impact exceeded even these devastating numbers. Coastal convoy crews sailed in constant fear of the silent predators that could appear from nowhere, launch torpedoes from point-blank range, and vanish before escorts could respond. British coastal forces in 1940 were woefully inadequate to counter this threat. The Royal Navy's motor torpedo boats, developed in the 1930s, were fast but fragile. Their plywood hulls, powered by gasoline engines, made them floating firebombs when hit. Their armament consisted of torpedoes for offense and typically just twin .303 machine guns for defense, wholly insufficient for fighting off determined E-boat attacks. Worse, their hard chine hulls pounded brutally in rough seas, limiting their operational effectiveness to calm conditions that rarely prevailed during Channel waters. The British boats also suffered from doctrinal confusion. Were they offensive weapons meant to attack enemy shipping, or defensive vessels meant to protect convoys? This uncertainty meant they excelled at neither role. When they attempted to intercept E-boats, they were outgunned. When they tried to attack enemy convoys off occupied Europe, they were too lightly armed to survive encounters with German escorts. Commander Robert Hitchens, who had become Britain's most successful coastal forces officer, experienced this inadequacy firsthand in early engagements. In August 1940, commanding MTB 69, he encountered a German S-boat flotilla off the Belgian coast. The British boats attempted to press home a torpedo attack but were driven off by superior German firepower. Hitchens watched helplessly as 20mm cannon fire tore through his boat's plywood hull, killing 2 crew members and forcing a retreat before any torpedoes could be launched. This pattern repeated throughout 1940 and 1941. British MTKPs would sight E-boats, attempt to engage, and find themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered. The Germans, recognizing British weakness, became increasingly aggressive. By late 1941, S-boat commanders were hunting British coastal forces as deliberately as they hunted merchant shipping, seeking to eliminate the threat before it could develop. The crisis reached its peak in early 1942. In January alone, E-boats sank 14 merchant ships and damaged 8 more in British coastal waters. The Admiralty calculated that if losses continued at this rate, Britain's coastal shipping system would collapse within 6 months. Something had to change, and change dramatically. The response came from multiple directions simultaneously. Captain Augustus Agar, himself a motor torpedo boat veteran from World War I and holder of the Victoria Cross, had been arguing since 1939 that British coastal forces needed heavier armament. He understood from bitter experience that speed and torpedoes alone weren't sufficient. Coastal craft needed guns, and plenty of them to fight their way through opposition and survive encounters with enemy forces. Agar's vision found support from an unlikely ally. The British Powerboat Company, headed by Hubert Scott Payne, had been building fast motorboats since the 1920s. Scott Payne understood high-speed hull design as well as anyone in Britain, and had been experimenting with modifications that might give British boats the seaworthiness needed to match German performance in rough weather. When Agar approached him about building a new generation of heavily armed gunboats, Scott Payne immediately grasped the potential. The result was the motor gunboat, a concept that would revolutionize British coastal warfare. Rather than trying to sink E-boats with torpedoes, a notoriously difficult proposition given the German boats' speed and maneuverability, MGBs would destroy them with concentrated gunfire. The boats would carry the heaviest armament that could be mounted on a small, fast hull, creating floating gun platforms capable of overwhelming enemy vessels through sheer firepower. The first true motor gunboats entered service in early 1942. These vessels, built by British Powerboat Company and Vosper Limited, represented a dramatic departure from earlier British coastal craft. At 71 to 73 feet in length, they were similar in size to MTBs, but carried vastly different armament. The standard MGB configuration included a 2-pounder cannon mounted forward, capable of firing 40mm shells at 115 rounds per minute. Amidships, a 6-pounder gun provided an even heavier punch, capable of defeating any armour an E-boat might carry. But the most distinctive feature was the power-operated machine gun turrets. British engineers had adapted the twin .50 caliber Vickers machine gun turret, originally developed for aircraft use. These turrets, electrically powered and capable of rapid traverse and elevation, gave MGBs the ability to pour concentrated fire onto enemy boats with unprecedented accuracy. Each turret fired 800 rounds per minute per gun, creating a stream of heavy machine gun fire that could shred plywood and light metal construction. Most MGBs carried at least 2 of these turrets, Some carried 3, giving them a combined rate of fire that exceeded 4,000 rounds per minute. The boats also incorporated lessons learned from 2 years of losing encounters with E-boats. Their hulls, while still using plywood construction for lightness, featured improved design that handled rough seas better than earlier British boats. The engines, still gasoline-powered Packard units producing a total of 4,000 horsepower, were given better vibration damping to reduce noise signature. Fuel tanks received better armor protection. Fire suppression systems were improved. Most critically, crews received armor protection for the first time, with gun positions shielded by light armor plate that could stop machine gun fire and shell fragments. The first MGBs entered service with coastal forces bases at Dover, Felixstowe, Great Yarmouth and Portsmouth in late 1941 and early 1942. Their arrival coincided with tactical innovations that would maximize their effectiveness. Rather than operating alone or in pairs as MTBs typically did, MGBs would hunt in flotillas of 4 to 6 boats, providing mutual support and overwhelming firepower. They would be paired with MTBs in mixed units, with the MGBs providing fire support while MTBs made torpedo attacks. Most importantly, they would seek engagement with E-boats rather than avoiding them. Robert Hitchens took command of the 8th MGB flotilla in February 1942. His orders were simple but revolutionary. Find E-boats, engage them, destroy them. For 2 years, British coastal forces had been the hunted. Now they would become the hunters. Hitchens, promoted to lieutenant commander, gathered his crews at Dover and explained the new reality. The days of running from E-boats were over. MGBs would deliberately seek out German boats and fight them to the finish. The first major engagement demonstrating the new British capability occurred on the night of March 13, 1942, the encounter that opened this narrative. Hitchens, commanding MGB 64, led a flotilla of 3 MGBs and 2 MTBs into the Channel, hunting for E-boats known to be operating against a coastal convoy. Shortly before 3 a.m, radar contacts indicated enemy boats to the northeast. The Germans, S-boats from the 2nd Schnellboot flotilla based at Ostend, were stalking the same convoy Hitchens was protecting. They detected the British boats simultaneously and turned to engage, confident in their superior armament and experience. The German commander, Kapitänleutnant Rudolf Pettersson, had engaged British MTBs numerous times and never lost an encounter. He expected another easy victory. What happened instead shocked the German crews. As the boats closed to firing range, the British opened up with concentrated fire from multiple machine gun turrets and cannon. Peterson's boat, S-105, suddenly found itself under fire from at least 6 heavy machine guns and 2 cannons simultaneously. Tracer rounds converged on the S-boat from multiple directions as British boats coordinated their fire. Within seconds, S-105's bridge was riddled with bullet holes. The forward 20mm cannon was knocked out. Peterson himself was wounded by shell fragments. The German crews attempted to return fire, but their relatively light armament, typically 2 20mm cannon and a few machine guns per boat, couldn't match the British volume of fire. S-107, attempting to come to S-105's aid, was hit repeatedly by 2-pounder shells that penetrated the boat's light construction and started fires below decks. The 3rd German boat, S-112, managed to launch 1 torpedo at the British flotilla, but missed in the confusion and smoke. The engagement lasted less than 10 minutes, but marked the turning point in Channel warfare. Hitchens' flotilla damaged all 3 E-boats severely enough to force their withdrawal. S-107 barely made it back to Ostend, listing heavily and with engine room flooding. British boats suffered minor damage from German return fire, but no casualties. For the first time in the war, E-boats had encountered opposition they couldn't overcome. German after-action reports reveal the shock this encounter produced. Peterson's report to headquarters noted that British boats had demonstrated firepower exceeding anything previously encountered. The weight of fire, particularly from power-operated machine gun turrets, had been overwhelming. He recommended avoiding engagement with the new British gunboats unless German forces possessed significant numerical superiority. This recommendation went unheeded. German Naval Command, particularly the S-boat force commander, Kapitän Sir C. Rudolf Peterson at headquarters in Wilhelmshaven, dismissed the report as exaggerated. S-boats had dominated Channel combat for 2 years. One difficult engagement didn't change strategic reality. German crews were ordered to continue aggressive operations against British shipping and to engage enemy coastal forces whenever encountered. This decision gave British MGBs the opportunity to demonstrate their capabilities repeatedly over the following months. Throughout spring and summer 1942, engagements between MGBs and E-boats became increasingly common and increasingly one-sided. The pattern established in that first March encounter repeated itself in waters from the Thames estuary to the Straits of Dover. April 17, 1942, off North Foreland. Lieutenant Commander Hitchens again, now with 4 MGBs and 3 MTBs, intercepted 5 E-boats attempting to intercept a convoy. The British boats, guided by radar aboard one of the MGBs, achieved surprise. The leading German boat never saw what hit it. Concentrated fire from multiple British boats struck a 79 simultaneously, killing the commander and most of the bridge crew instantly. The boat, out of control, circled wildly while 2 other E-boats attempted to provide covering fire. British MTBs pressed through the melee and launched torpedoes at close range, damaging S-82 severely. The surviving German boats withdrew at high speed, abandoning their attack on the convoy. May 23, 1942, near Dover Strait. 6 British MGBs under Lieutenant Peter Dickens engaged 4 E-boats in a running gun battle that lasted 30 minutes. The British boats, operating in 2 divisions of 3, coordinated their fire to concentrate overwhelming force on individual German boats sequentially. S-109 was hit by over 200 rounds from heavy machine guns and multiple cannon shells, suffering 18 casualties and barely remaining afloat. S-67 had her forward torpedo tube destroyed by a direct hit from a 6-pounder gun. The engagement ended only when the Germans successfully broke contact using smoke screens, leaving behind 1 boat dead in the water that had to be towed back to Boulogne. June 14, 1942, off Beachy Head, 8 British boats, 4 MGBs and 4 MTBs ambushed 3 E-boats attacking a coastal convoy. The German boats, caught in searchlight beams from the convoy escorts and under fire from the MGBs simultaneously, never had a chance to organize effective resistance. S-113 was sunk, the first E-boat destroyed by British coastal forces gunfire in the war. Her commander, Oberleutnant Sir C. Hans Schirren, and 18 crew members were killed. The surviving German boats escaped only because British MTBs, attempting to follow up with torpedo attacks, collided with each other in the darkness. These engagements established patterns that would dominate Channel warfare for the remainder of 1942 and throughout 1943. British MGBs operating in coordinated flotillas systematically hunted E-boats with increasing success. The Germans, forced onto the defensive for the first time in the war, attempted various tactical responses. They increased the gun armament on new S-boats, adding more 20mm and even 37mm cannon. They modified tactics to avoid close engagement, attempting to use their torpedoes from longer range. They increased the use of smoke screens to break contact when British gunboats appeared. None of these measures restored German dominance. The fundamental problem was that British boats now possessed superior firepower in the short-range engagements that characterized Channel combat. E-boats carrying 2 torpedoes needed to close within 1,000 yards for effective attack. At that range, British MGB firepower was devastating. German attempts to engage at longer range reduced their torpedo effectiveness, while British guns remained lethal. The evolution of British tactics accelerated the shift in balance. By mid-1942, coastal forces had developed sophisticated procedures for coordinated operations. Flotillas would typically include both MGBs and MTBs, with each type assigned specific roles. MGBs would engage enemy boats with gunfire, forcing them to maneuver defensively and disrupting their attack formations. While E-boats were occupied defending themselves against the MGBs, British MTBs would maneuver for torpedo shots. This combination of gun and torpedo attack proved far more effective than either alone. British boats also gained technological advantages beyond firepower. Radar, initially primitive and unreliable, improved dramatically through 1942 and 1943. By late 1943, British coastal forces boats carried Type 291 radar sets, capable of detecting surfaced vessels at ranges exceeding 5 miles. This allowed British boats to find E-boats in conditions of darkness or reduced visibility, where visual detection was impossible. German boats, which carried no radar throughout most of the war, were increasingly fighting blind against an enemy that could see them electronically. The British also developed superior communications equipment. High-frequency radio sets allowed flotilla commanders to coordinate multiple boats effectively, directing them onto targets and concentrating force. German boats relied on lower frequency radios with shorter range and poorer clarity, making coordination more difficult. In the confused night actions that characterized Channel combat, this communications advantage often proved decisive. Training improvements complemented technological advances. Coastal forces established a comprehensive training program at bases including HMS B at Weymouth and HMS Hornet at Gosport. Crews practiced gunnery extensively, firing thousands of rounds at target sleeves towed by aircraft and at floating targets. They rehearsed formation maneuvers until boats could operate together instinctively in darkness. They trained in damage control, learning to fight fires and control flooding while under fire. By 1943, British coastal forces crews were arguably the best-trained small boat sailors in any navy. German crews, conversely, suffered from declining training quality as the war progressed. Early war S-boat crews had been highly trained professionals, often with years of experience. By 1943, casualties and the expansion of the S-boat force meant that many crews consisted of hastily trained replacements with minimal experience. Young commanders fresh from training found themselves facing British veterans who had survived dozens of actions. The experience differential showed in engagement outcomes. The numerical balance also shifted decisively in Britain's favour. In 1940, the Royal Navy had operated fewer than 30 coastal forces boats of all types. By mid-1943, over 400 MGBs, MTBs and motor launches were operational, with production continuing at accelerating rates. Germany, facing demands for U-boats, destroyers and larger vessels, never produced S-boats in comparable numbers. The entire S-boat force peaked at approximately 120 boats, with rarely more than 60 operational simultaneously. This numerical superiority allowed British forces to maintain continuous patrols that German boats couldn't avoid. Every night, multiple British flotillas swept assigned patrol areas, hunting E-boats. German boats attempting to attack convoys found themselves intercepted repeatedly, often by multiple British flotillas converging on reported contacts. The hunters had become the hunted. Individual British commanders developed reputations that intimidated German crews. Robert Hitchens, promoted to commander, became legendary for aggressive tactics and exceptional boat handling. His personal score included 3 E-boats sunk and at least 12 damaged. Peter Dickens, another highly successful MGB commander, developed innovative tactics for night combat that became standard throughout coastal forces. Christopher Dreyer, commanding MGBs from Felixstowe, specialized in ambushing E-boats attempting to transit through the Dover Strait. German commanders responded with their own tactical innovations, but increasingly they were innovations born of desperation rather than dominance. Rudolf Peterson, commanding S-boat operations from headquarters, emphasized avoiding combat with British gunboats unless absolutely necessary. S-boat commanders were instructed to complete their primary mission of attacking merchant shipping and to engage enemy escorts only when unavoidable. This defensive mindset marked a complete reversal from the aggressive hunting tactics that had characterized German operations in 1940 and 1941. Some German officers refused to accept this defensive posture. Kapitänleutnant Bernd Klug, commanding the 5th S-boat flotilla from Cherbourg, believed aggressive tactics could still succeed. On August 12, 1942, he led 8 S-boats against a heavily escorted convoy off Portland. The British escort included 6 MGBs under Lieutenant Commander Hitchens. When the two forces met, Klug ordered his boats to press home attacks despite heavy fire. The resulting engagement was the largest single action between coastal forces to that point in the war. 8 German boats faced 6 British MGBs and multiple destroyers providing distant support. The battle raged for 45 minutes across 10 miles of ocean. Klug's boat, S-68, was hit repeatedly but continued attacking, damaging one merchant ship with torpedo fire. S-46 and S-90 also scored torpedo hits, sinking 2 merchants totaling 8,000 tons, but the cost was catastrophic. S-86 was sunk by concentrated gunfire from 3 MGBs. S-71 was so badly damaged she sank while under tow back to Cherbourg. 3 other German boats suffered heavy damage and casualties. German losses exceeded 50 men killed or wounded. British losses were comparatively light. 2 MGBs suffered moderate damage requiring dockyard repairs. Casualties totaled 3 men killed and 7 wounded. The merchant ships lost hurt, but the convoy system could absorb such losses. The S-boat force couldn't sustain losing 2 boats and having half a flotilla damaged in a single action. After Portland, German commanders universally adopted cautious tactics, avoiding engagement with British gunboats whenever possible. This caution created opportunities for British coastal forces to expand their mission beyond convoy protection. MGBs began conducting offensive operations against German coastal traffic along the occupied European coast. German convoys carrying supplies and reinforcements to French and Belgian ports found themselves under attack by British boats that possessed both the firepower to engage escorts and the speed to escape pursuing destroyers. These offensive sweeps proved highly successful throughout 1943. British flotillas, often operating far from friendly waters, struck German convoys repeatedly. The pattern was consistent. British boats would approach under cover of darkness, using radar to locate targets. MGBs would engage escorts with gunfire while MTBs launched torpedoes at merchant ships. Before German forces could organize an effective response, the British boats would be racing back toward England at maximum speed. The success of these operations forced Germany to divert significant resources to convoy protection. Destroyers that might have operated against Allied Atlantic shipping were instead tied down escorting coastal convoys. Flak ships, floating anti-aircraft batteries, were stationed at intervals along convoy routes to provide some defense against British attacks. Mining operations intensified, attempting to close approaches to German-held ports. None of these measures eliminated British raids, which continued to inflict losses throughout 1943 and 1944. The Allied invasion of France in June 1944 represented the culmination of British coastal forces' transformation. On D-Day night, June 6th into 7th, 1944, over 100 British MGBs and MTBs formed a protective screen off the Normandy beaches, defending the invasion fleet against expected E-boat attacks. German S-boats from bases at Cherbourg and Brittany did attempt to attack the massive Allied armada, but they were intercepted repeatedly by British coastal forces operating in coordinated flotillas. The engagements that night demonstrated how completely the balance had shifted. German boats, attempting to break through to the vulnerable transport ships and landing craft, found themselves facing overwhelming opposition. Every approach was blocked by British flotillas that possessed superior numbers, heavier armament, and better coordination. The few E-boats that managed to penetrate close enough to launch torpedoes found themselves under fire from multiple directions simultaneously. Of the 9 S-boats that sortied against the invasion fleet that night, 3 were sunk and 4 heavily damaged. Not a single Allied ship was lost to E-boat attack. The weeks following D-Day saw increasingly desperate German attempts to disrupt Allied supply lines across the Channel. Every night, surviving S-boats attempted to reach the endless stream of ships supplying the Normandy beachhead. Every night, British coastal forces intercepted them. The loss rate became unsustainable. Between June and September 1944, Germany lost over 20 S-boats to all causes, with the majority sunk or damaged by British coastal forces. Production couldn't replace these losses, and crew casualties decimated the experienced corps of S-boat commanders. By autumn 1944, German S-boat operations had been reduced to occasional nuisance raids. The boats that had terrorized British coastal waters in 1940 and 1941 were now confined to heavily protected anchorages, emerging only when intelligence indicated unusually favorable opportunities. Even then, British coastal forces hunted them relentlessly. The psychological transformation was complete. German crews who had once hunted British shipping with impunity now feared every appearance of British gunboats that could pour devastating fire onto them from multiple directions. The final major engagement between British MGBs and German E-boats occurred on April 13, 1945, off the Dutch coast. 6 British boats from the 55th MGB flotilla, commanded by Lieutenant Alan Jensen, intercepted 4 E-boats attempting to lay mines in Allied supply routes. The German boats, undermanned and short of fuel, attempted to break contact immediately when British boats appeared on radar. Jensen's flotilla pursued at maximum speed, catching the trailing German boat within 15 minutes. The brief engagement that followed was utterly one-sided. Concentrated fire from 3 MGBs struck S-207 with overwhelming force. The German boat exploded in a massive fireball when a shell penetrated her fuel tanks. There were no survivors. The remaining German boats escaped into coastal minefields where British boats couldn't follow. Less than a month later, Germany surrendered. The final count showed that British coastal forces had sunk or damaged over 150 German S-boats during the war, with MGBs accounting for the majority of these victories. The force that had numbered fewer than 30 boats in 1940 had grown to over 400 vessels and had completely reversed the tactical situation in coastal waters. The transformation from hunted to hunter represented one of the Royal Navy's most significant achievements of the war.